In 2018, the Malaysian government walked into a room and tried to cancel the biggest infrastructure project in the country's history. They lost. Not in court, not in a vote. They lost at the negotiating table, and they walked out having saved $5 billion, which sounds like a win until you realize what they actually agreed to. You heard that right. Malaysia tried to kill this railway, succeeded in cutting the price, and still ended up with Chinese engineers drilling through its central mountain range. If you want to understand how a single railway quietly rewrote the map of Asian trade, hit subscribe, because the real story is not the construction, and it is not the price tag. It is what Washington only just figured out. A country cut in half. Pull up a map of Malaysia and look at the peninsula. Not the whole country, just the long finger of land hanging down from Thailand towards Singapore. On paper, it is one nation, one flag, one government, one economy. But spend any time studying how it actually functions, and a different picture emerges. Malaysia is not one country, it is two. The West Coast is the Malaysia the world knows. Kuala Lumpur and its glass towers, Port Klang humming day and night with container ships, manufacturing belts running from the capital down toward Johor, highways thick with freight, foreign investment flowing in through ports that have been wired into global trade for over a century. Around 30% of the entire national economy is generated on this strip of coast. Then you cross the spine of the country, and you arrive in a different Malaysia entirely. The East Coast states Kelantan, Terengganu, Pahang, quieter, poorer, slower. Beautiful in a way the West Coast no longer is, but cut off in a way that has shaped the lives of millions of people for generations. Less foreign investment, less manufacturing, less of almost everything that makes a modern economy hum. And the reason for the split is not politics, it is geography. Running down the middle of the peninsula is a continuous mountain backbone roughly 300 miles long. 300 miles is the distance from Boston to Washington, D.C., except instead of a flat highway corridor, picture an unbroken wall of steep tropical jungle. For most of Malaysia's modern history, this range has functioned like a fence between two backyards. You can technically get over it, but it is hard, it is slow, and it makes serious trade between the two coasts almost impossible. Think of it like this. Imagine your country has two cities, both desperate to do business with each other, but every truck has to climb a steep wet hill, navigate twisting forest roads, and arrive 12 to 15 hours later, soaked and shaken. That is what east-west freight in Malaysia has looked like for decades. The roads were never built for heavy industrial traffic. They were built to connect villages, not economies. Here is the part most people miss. Every Malaysian government since independence has tried to solve this. Every single one. Bridges were proposed, highways were upgraded, rail studies were commissioned. Reports gathered dust. The terrain defeated every plan. The cost defeated the rest. Western lenders looked at the numbers and walked away. The mountain range stayed exactly where it had always been, and the East Coast stayed exactly as poor as it had always been. For decades, this was just the way things were. A regional gap nobody could close, a geography nobody could beat. Until somebody arrived with $16 billion and a different idea about what mountains were for. The wall down the middle. Walk with me up onto that mountain range and look at what every previous government was actually staring at. Because the words mountain range make this sound like something familiar. Something you have driven past on a road trip. It is not. The range has a name, the Titiwangsa, and it is not really a range in the way an American would picture one. It is a continuous tropical jungle wall, rising sharply out of the lowlands, climbing fast, and refusing to flatten out for hundreds of miles. The slopes are steep enough that vehicles cannot simply drive across them. The canopy is thick enough that, in stretches, sunlight does not reach the ground. And then there is the rain. The Titiwangsa receives over 100 inches of rainfall every single year. 100 inches is enough water to fill a bathtub every few days for an entire year, falling on the same hillside over and over again for decades. The result is ground that never fully dries out. Soil that slides, slopes that collapse, rivers that swell into floods without warning. Engineers call this kind of terrain unstable. The rest of us would call it a place where building anything large feels like a bad idea. Think of it like this. Imagine trying to lay railway track across a wet sponge balanced on top of a steep hill. Every time you press the rail into place, the sponge shifts. Every time it rains, the slope gives way a little more. That is the engineering reality that Titiwangsa presents. Here is what most people get wrong. When they hear mountain range, they picture tunnels through dry rock. Hard work, but predictable work. The Titiwangsa is not dry rock. In some stretches, it is hard granite. In other stretches, it is waterlogged clay. In still others, it is fractured shale that crumbles the moment you cut into it. The geological conditions change every few miles along the same route. A tunnel boring machine that works in one section becomes useless in the next. This is why every previous Malaysian government failed. The terrain did not just demand engineering talent. It demanded an engineering ecosystem, multiple drilling techniques running in parallel, the construction capacity to operate at dozens of work sites simultaneously, and the willingness to absorb cost overruns when a section unexpectedly turned from rock into mud. Here is the part that puts everything into perspective. Western contractors did look at this project several times, and every time they ran the numbers, looked at the rainfall data, studied the soil reports, and quietly stepped away. The cost-to-risk ratio did not work. The financing terms Malaysia could offer did not match the engineering challenge the terrain presented. The job sat on the shelf for years, waiting for somebody willing to take it on. And then a different kind of construction company walked into the room. One that had drilled through the Himalayas, one that had built railways across the Tibetan Plateau, one that had the balance sheet to absorb risk no commercial contractor would touch. But before we get to the engineering, you have to understand the deal that made the engineering possible. Because the $16 billion offer that landed in Kuala Lumpur did not just come with construction capacity. It came with terms nobody else was willing to write. The $16 billion offer. Picture the meeting. Kuala Lumpur, 2016. A Malaysian government that has spent decades watching its east coast fall further behind. A project file on the table thick with feasibility studies and cost estimates from every previous attempt. And across that table, a Chinese delegation with a number nobody else has ever been willing to write down. $16 billion. $16 billion is more than the entire annual federal budget of a mid-sized European country, offered up for a single railway in a single corner of Southeast Asia. Here is what makes the offer remarkable. It was not just the size of the check, it was the structure of the check. China was not asking Malaysia to pay $16 billion up front. China was offering to finance most of it through long-term loans from Chinese state-backed banks at interest rates Malaysia could actually carry, with repayment schedules stretching across decades. The construction would be done by a Chinese state company. The materials would come from Chinese suppliers. The engineering would come from Chinese expertise. Think of it like a contractor showing up at your front door and offering to renovate your entire house. He says you do not have to pay him today. He will lend you the money himself. His own crew will do the work. His own supplier will deliver the materials. You just sign here, and the project starts on Monday. For a Malaysian government facing decades of failed attempts and Western lenders who had walked away, this was an offer that did not exist anywhere else on Earth, so they signed. Here is the part most people skip past too quickly. Why would China write a check this large for a railway across somebody else's country? The official answer is friendship, trade, Belt and Road cooperation. The polite words that get said at ribbon cuttings. But polite words do not explain $16 billion. The real answer sits on a map. The west coast of Malaysia ends at Port Klang, one of the busiest container ports on the Strait of Malacca. The east coast of Malaysia opens onto the South China Sea. Between those two coastlines sits the mountain range we just walked through. And if you could push a railway from one coast to the other, you would not just be connecting two halves of Malaysia, you would be building a piece of track that lets cargo cross between two oceans without using the southern shipping lanes of the strait at all. This is the part nobody on the Malaysian side fully grasped at the time. The railway was being sold as a domestic development project. It was being financed as a domestic development project. But the value China was pricing it at was not domestic, it was strategic. And strategic value is the kind of number that justifies a $16 billion check when a purely commercial calculation does not. Here is the brutal catch. The moment Malaysia signed the deal, the geography of Southeast Asian trade quietly began to shift. Not visibly, not yet, but the survey crews started arriving. The drilling rigs started rolling in, and the first cuts into the Titiwangsa began. And that is when the engineering story turned into something nobody on either side had fully prepared for. Drilling through the spine of Malaysia. Now, stand at the foot of the Titiwangsa and look up at what the crews actually had to do. Because once the contracts were signed, the romance of the project ended and the brutal reality began. The route demanded over 40 tunnels. 40 separate bores cut through different sections of the same mountain range because no single tunnel could possibly stretch the entire length. The combined length of all those tunnels exceeds 30 miles. 30 miles of railway track buried inside rock and earth, that is the length of a half marathon, run entirely underground, in the dark. One of those tunnels stretches over 10 miles on its own. 10 miles is the distance from one end of central London to the other, drilled in a single continuous bore through tropical mountain. It is one of the longest railway tunnels anywhere in Southeast Asia, and every single foot of it had to be cut, lined, and stabilized while the rainforest above kept dropping water onto the worksite. Think of it like this. Imagine drilling a hole through a wet sandcastle. The sand is fine in some sections, hard in others, and gives way to mud the moment you press too hard. Now, scale that up to a mountain range, and you are roughly where the engineers found themselves. Here is what makes this construction genuinely jaw-dropping. The crews could not use one method across the entire route. The geology changed every few miles. In one section, they used tunnel boring machines, enormous cylindrical drills that grind through rock at a steady, controlled pace. In the next section, those machines were useless because the ground was too unstable. So the crews switched to drill and blast controlled explosions, section by section, with workers clearing debris between each round. In some stretches, they ran both techniques simultaneously on different parts of the same tunnel because the rock changed mid-bore. And the tunnels were only part of the problem. Between 30 and 40% of the entire railway runs on viaducts. Viaducts are essentially long concrete bridges lifting the track above the ground. Why? Because the lowland sections of the route flood every monsoon. Rivers swell, plains turn into shallow, lakes for weeks at a time. A railway laid on the ground would be unusable for months a year, so the engineers lifted it up, sometimes 2 stories above the forest floor, and let the floods pass underneath. Here is the part most people skip over. Before any of this could begin, the crews had to reach the work sites. And in huge stretches of the Titiwangsa, there were no roads, no clearings. No way to move a tunnel boring machine the size of a small building into position. So before they could drill, they had to build. Temporary access roads cut through rainforest by hand and machine, just to deliver the equipment that would then start the real construction. By the time the first sections were complete, China had done something every previous Malaysian government had been told was impossible. The mountain range that had divided the country for generations now had a railway running through it. The track was real. The tunnels were lined. The viaducts were standing. And then, exactly when the project was about to enter its most expensive phase, Malaysia tried to cancel the whole thing. The cancellation that wasn't. May 2018. Malaysian voters do something nobody expected. They throw out the government that signed the railway deal. The new prime minister walks into office with a stack of files about projects he never approved, signed by a predecessor now facing corruption charges. And right at the top of the stack sits the East Coast Rail Link. He does what almost no Belt and Road recipient government had ever done. He suspends it. Construction halts. Survey teams are sent home. Drilling rigs stop spinning. The new government opens the books, looks at the financing terms, and starts asking questions in public that previous governments had only asked behind closed doors. Was the price inflated? Were the loan terms predatory? Did Malaysia actually need this railway, or was it a sweetheart deal between political insiders and a foreign power? For a few months in 2018, the entire project sat on the brink of cancellation. This was not a delay. This was the single most serious challenge any Belt and Road project had ever faced from a recipient country. Western analysts watched closely. Other Belt and Road borrowers, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Kenya, watched even more closely. If Malaysia could walk away, the whole model was in trouble. Here is what most people get wrong about what happened next. They think Malaysia won. They look at the headlines and see the price drop from $16 billion to roughly $11 billion and conclude the Malaysians outnegotiated Beijing. $5 billion knocked off the bill is a real win in any negotiation. Except it was not really a win. It was something stranger. Think of it like this. Imagine you are renovating that house we mentioned earlier. Halfway through the work, you tell the contractor you cannot afford it and you want to cancel. Most contractors would either sue you or walk away with their materials. This contractor does something else entirely. He says, "Fine, I will cut my price by a third. I will redesign the route. I will keep my crew on site, and I will keep lending you the money. Just please do not cancel." That is not a contractor losing a negotiation. That is a contractor revealing exactly how badly he wants the job. And the moment you see that, you should ask yourself, why? If this is the part of the story you wish more people understood, hit subscribe, because what comes next is the answer. The answer is that the railway's value to China was never in the construction contract. Construction contracts are profitable, but they are not strategic. The strategic value sat in the corridor itself, the permanent, embedded position along a transport route connecting the Indian Ocean to the South China Sea. The $5 billion discount was the price Beijing was willing to pay to keep that position. Cheaper than losing it. Cheaper, in fact, than almost any alternative. Malaysia walked out of that negotiation feeling like it had won. And, in narrow financial terms, it had. But the deeper question, who walked out with the strategic asset, had a different answer entirely. Because the railway was never really about connecting Kuala Lumpur to Kuantan. It was about connecting two oceans. And once you see that, the entire project stops looking like a Malaysian infrastructure deal and starts looking like something else entirely. The railway was never about Malaysia. Pull back from the construction site and look at the railway on a regional map. Forget Malaysia for a moment. Look at the two coastlines the track connects. On the west end, the railway terminates at Port Klang. Port Klang sits on the Strait of Malacca, the same narrow shipping lane where roughly a quarter of all global trade passes under the watchful eye of the United States Navy. On the east end, the railway opens onto the South China Sea, with direct access to the shipping lanes heading north toward China and Japan. Now think about what that means. A container arriving at Port Klang from the Middle East no longer has to sail south through the most congested section of the strait, around Singapore, and back up the South China Sea. It can be lifted onto a train, sent across the peninsula by rail, and loaded onto a different ship on the other side. The southern stretch of the strait gets bypassed entirely. Think of it like a busy toll road every truck in the region has to use. Then somebody quietly builds a private bypass around the toll booth. The bypass does not handle every shipment. But for the people who own it, it is a permanent option that did not exist before, and the toll booth quietly loses some of its leverage. Here is what most people get wrong. They look at the ECRL as one project. It is not. It is one piece of a continental architecture China has been building for 2 decades. There is the China-Laos Railway running south through Southeast Asia. There are the Myanmar pipelines walking oil and gas into China's southwest. There is the Gwadar port complex on the Pakistani coast. There is the network of port investments spread across the Indian Ocean rim. Each one looks like a standalone deal, but step back far enough and the pattern becomes obvious. China is not building infrastructure. China is building a system. The ECRL is just the Malaysian segment of it. None of these projects individually breaks American leverage. That is the brilliance of the strategy. Each one signs as a domestic development project. Each one is financed as a commercial loan. And taken together, they are doing something the United States has only recently started to articulate publicly. But before we celebrate the strategy, we have to be honest about its limits. Because the railway has weaknesses too, and the cheerleaders rarely talk about them. The question Washington is finally asking. Listen to this next part carefully. The East Coast Rail Link, for all the strategic weight it carries, will move only a fraction of what passes through the Strait of Malacca on any given day. The strait handles a volume of trade no single railway can come close to matching. The ECRL is a side door, not a replacement for the front gate. Here is the brutal catch. The debt Malaysia took on is real. Loan repayments stretch across decades. If global interest rates shift, if Malaysia's currency weakens, if a future government wants to renegotiate again, the financial pressure of this deal will sit on Malaysian books long after the ribbon-cutting headlines fade. And the railway's strategic value to China depends on Malaysian political stability across a 30-year operating horizon. That is a long bet on the predictability of somebody else's politics. But here is the reframe that changes how you see the whole story. Malaysia tried to cancel this railway. They suspended construction. They opened the books in public. They negotiated the price down by $5 billion. And they still ended up with Chinese engineers inside their central mountain range, Chinese debt inside their national budget, and Chinese logistics companies positioned at both ends of a land bridge connecting two oceans. Think of it like this. Imagine you tried to evict somebody from your house, succeeded in cutting their rent in half, and then realized they had already rewired the electricity, repaved the driveway, and installed the locks on every door. You did not evict them. You renegotiated the terms of their permanent presence. That is the position Malaysia is in. And here is the part Washington has only just figured out. Malaysia is not alone. The same deal, with the same structure, with the same logic, is being signed right now in countries across Asia, Africa, and the Pacific. Each one looks like a domestic infrastructure project. Each one is financed as a commercial loan. Each one is announced with photographs of smiling officials and ribbon scissors. And taken together, they are quietly building a transport architecture that the United States Navy was never designed to monitor, and the United States Treasury was never designed to compete with. The Strait of Malacca is still the front gate of Asian trade. America still patrols it. American allies still ring it. But the side doors keep opening, one railway, one pipeline, one port at a time. The question is no longer whether China won this negotiation. The question is how many other countries are signing the same deal right now without realizing what they have agreed to. If this changed the way you think about infrastructure and power, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Now, I want to hear from you in the comments. Is China outsmarting the West with patient infrastructure diplomacy, or is the West asleep at the wheel while the map of global trade is being redrawn under its nose?